Hello everyone. Dasein, being as such, being in time, facticity of Dasein. You have heard all of these terms related to Heideggerian oeuvre, but there is something that grounds all of this, and that is phenomenology. Let's continue our journey of phenomenological research and understand the fundamental concepts and disagreements that gave rise to the haunting figure of the Dasein, whose shadow is becoming longer as the history of philosophy is moving forward. Last time round, we looked at the birth of modern phenomenology. Heidegger's name was barely mentioned without expanding upon his contribution to phenomenology. He was Husserl's student. Precisely this was mentioned and nothing more. In this video, you are going to know the exact relationship between Heidegger and Husserl phenomenologically. Well, everyone knows Heidegger, so we are not going to spend time on introducing him as we have already talked about him in previous couple of videos. This time round, we are going to focus on the birth of being and time, the birth of the Dasein. We are going to see how Heidegger developed, while criticizing his teacher, his approach in philosophy, which, by the way, he almost equated at time with phenomenology. When we read his letters to his friends, his colleagues, his students, we often find references to philosophy, when he actually means phenomenology. One thing is for sure, Husserl's approach left an indelible mark on Heidegger. It helped him enormously with a massive breakout from the heavy metal arguments of metaphysics that perhaps only a handful of academics care about. What mattered for Heidegger the most was life in everyday instances. When you cross the road, when you hit a hammer on the nail, when you go to a barber, etc., etc. And this remained his center of attention in his formative years in academia. I'm talking about the years leading up to the publication of Being and Time in 1927. Before he published his magnum opus, he was Husserl's assistant lecturer. They spent many a days and nights together in a closed group discussing the ins and outs of phenomenology. So much so that when Heidegger published Being and Time, he dedicated it to Husserl. But then during the Nazi era, he removed that dedication under the influence of anti-Semitism because Husserl was a Jew. Later on, he paid its price and learned his lesson well. What price did he pay and how did he regret doing what he did? That's a topic for another day. The question that really concerned Heidegger during his formative years was the methodology of phenomenology. How should one do phenomenology? But before we go on ahead and talk about his understanding of the quote-unquote correct way of doing phenomenology, it suffices to mention one instance from his autobiographical essay entitled My Way to Phenomenology, where he says that Husserl allowed him into his discussions and even encouraged him in his endeavor, but his master was always at bottom in disagreement with him. This tells us that the seeds of disagreement were there from the beginning and both knew it. But Husserl was more patient and welcoming than Heidegger during these years. Heidegger was Husserl's assistant from 1919 to 1923, and once he got done with his apprenticeship and began his onslaught on Husserl's ideas by giving a lecture in 1923 entitled Introduction to Phenomenological Research, which Husserl attended as well. This lecture was the watershed moment when Heidegger announced literally in front of his mentor that he disagreed with him on many things. We can almost see Husserl leaving the lecture hall midway through the lectures. To recap in as much less words as possible what we talked about last time, Husserl's phenomenological method has three elements, which can also be called three stages. The first is phenomenological reduction of the phenomenon under scrutiny. The second, the eidetic reduction of the phenomenon. And third, the constitutive elements of the intentional act and its object. All this phenomenological analysis is done with the purpose of, and this is the key to it all, with the purpose of studying consciousness. So Husserl's ultimate objective is to reach an a priori eternal science of consciousness and its objectivities. This kind of science is now known as eidetic science in academic circles. And this name in itself betrays what is at stake when we talk about phenomenology today, the eidetic reduction of the phenomenon. It later became the major bone of contention between Heidegger and Husserl. We're just going to come to that. But what was wrong with all of this? Why did Heidegger not just carry on Husserl's project? That's the question. Well, to understand that, we just need to read the title of his book, Being and Time, and we get our response. Husserl is more interested in the things themselves. He is interested in bracketing out the clutter put on by the historical, cultural, and social nomenclature on pure phenomenological concepts. He is also disturbed by the intrusion of scientific attitude in this pure research, which is heavily indebted to empirical, objective way of thinking. Interestingly enough, this latter concern of scientific attitude is common in Heidegger as well, but he takes it one step ahead. Whereas Husserl wanted to redefine science to include phenomenology in it. Heidegger, on the other hand, is skeptical of even calling phenomenology a science. And this is not in any pejorative sense, but in a liberating sense. According to Heidegger, it is impossible that any understanding of being can be termed a science, because the variety and liveliness of lived experience is too vast to be placed nicely into scientific categories. In other words, Heidegger is not just concerned about how beings are conscious of or about something, rather, he is interested in being itself. His major concern is ontology, but he would study ontology phenomenologically. Let's do phenomenology now. So, to inquire into the phenomenological foundations of Dasein, we are going to begin with the understanding of the phenomenon called Dasein, and consequently dig further to reach its elemental constitution. What is meant by Dasein? According to Heidegger, Dasein is a being which is thrown into the world where being with capital B rules. But Dasein does not have complete and robust understanding of being with capital B. That does not mean, consequently, that it has no understanding at all. It has some implicit understanding of being with capital B, and while exploring this understanding and turning inward through understanding itself, it can reach the understanding of being, capital B again. That is to say, the more Dasein engrosses with the questioning of being, the more it advances towards the authentic understanding of being. So this is a condensed, summarized version of the presentation of Dasein presented in Being and Time. Once we start deconstructing this definition, we will encounter the phenomenological foundations of Dasein. Three elements jump out immediately from this definition: being as problem, implicit understanding, facticity or the text of experience with its thrownness. First up, being as problem. The breakthrough of the process of understanding being in itself is important to note. There are many beings in this world. There are inanimate beings like tables, chairs, and wine. And then there are animate beings like cats, dogs, and lions. Within these animate beings also lie humans. But in all of these modes of being, it is only humans who possess the potentialities of Dasein. Others do not. Tables, chairs, cats, and dogs never go around building philosophy departments in universities spending millions on the question of being. This Dasein-esque potentiality is particularly characteristic of humans. I am deliberately here creating a distance between Dasein and human being to clarify an important point that for sure Heidegger has humans in mind when talking about Dasein. Being and Time is about humans, but the way he articulates the problem fundamentally is ontological in nature, not metaphysical. It is not in our consciousness to do philosophical questioning. According to Heidegger, this phenomenal capacity is at the heart of the ontological structure of our mode of being, i.e., Dasein. Anyways, to cut the story short, when Husserl took up the question of intentionality following his teacher Brentano, he focused on the questioning attitude of our consciousness. How is it that we interrogate the internal consciousness? But when Heidegger explores this questioning attitude, he juxtaposes it as the core of Dasein's relation with the world and itself, not just in terms of consciousness, but in terms of its mode of being. We certainly have to learn how to think and acquire this art. But when we are thrown into the world, which has its preset nexus of meanings, we certainly have a certain implicit understanding of how to be. Nobody teaches a baby that it must cry if hungry or thirsty. Being equips us with the necessary ontological intentionality. Therefore, we come into this world with certain pre-reflective, pre-formed relations with the world and with our own selves. Then comes the second element of facticity of Dasein, which is the consequence of its thrownness into the world. Facticity can be defined as the social, cultural, and historical coordinates of Dasein into which it is thrown. When we open our eyes in this world, we do not find it a blank slate or a tabula rasa, as Locke calls it, which we can easily analyze and wish to be according to our liking and whatnot. There is nothing behind this facticity, as Heidegger clarifies. He says that it is impossible for Dasein to go behind its thrownness. The historicity or facticity is the springboard from which any philosophy or in fact any thought can begin. This is in contrast to reaching the things themselves, as Husserl claimed. There is no possibility of a priori analysis of facticity. It just is. Remember the fundamental question of ontology. What is there? Facticity is just is. It just exists, that is to say. This concept of facticity was borrowed from Dilthey by Heidegger. It is not exactly word to word what Dilthey proposes, but very close to it. In fact, Heidegger was more influenced by the existential hermeneutic analysis of Dilthey than Husserlian phenomenology. Dilthey's main idea was that man understands himself more through history than through reflection. When he read Husserl's logical investigations, he agreed with the first volume where Husserl has debunked the natural attitude in empirical psychologism. But in his second volume, he has fallen back into the trap of a priori analyses, which according to Dilthey and consequently Heidegger is an inhuman task. And this is where Heidegger's and Dilthey's hermeneutic approach intersect. Because Heidegger rejects the primacy of Husserl's descriptive eidetic scientific method and adopts the descriptive hermeneutic scientific method. Just a word on Dilthey's hermeneutic triadic model, because it is necessary for anyone reading Being and Time to know this well. Dilthey proposes that the lived experience is grasped and analyzed through understanding the historicity of the experience and then expressed in words, which then goes on to further furnish and enhance the lived experience. This is the famous hermeneutic circle, which roughly is present almost in the same manner in Heideggerian oeuvre. But since Heidegger is more concerned with the experience of Dasein, therefore for him, what becomes more important in his ontological analysis of Dasein is the text of experience, or better put, experience as text. Now we could better understand why Heidegger thinks that no phenomenological analysis can go behind facticity and implicit understanding. It is simply because one cannot go behind language. Because it is assumed that whatever is being analyzed must first be objectivized and then the mind runs its mill of reflective analysis on it, thereby producing the marvels of philosophy. The problem with doing phenomenology of Dasein in this manner is that our thoughts are hermeneutically conditioned. There is no phenomenology without language. Therefore, at least according to Heidegger, there can be no debunking of a priori stuff in our consciousness. This is why he stresses more upon understanding as disclosure or unveiling of being, which always remains a task to be finished, but never reached the terminal point, rather than a science. Understanding in Heideggerian sense equals mimicking the generation of the original meaning itself. To sum it up, Heidegger considers the primacy of the questioning attitude of being as the springboard of his inquiry, whereas Husserl focuses more on stepwise reduction of our lived experience in consciousness to reach the things themselves. For Husserl, there exists a possibility to unravel fundamental a priori laws of consciousness, kind of. But for Heidegger, that would be too difficult a task to achieve by a human. Instead, phenomenology must turn its attention to the unveiling of the Dasein in all its liveliness. But one thing is for sure in both these approaches, they both believe certainly that they are doing phenomenology. Heidegger is doing phenomenology of being, whereas Husserl is doing phenomenology of consciousness. Thank you, everyone.